Several years ago, I watched an interesting video by Bill Gates. Stuck in my mind ever since then. He said he thinks we're still in the Stone Age with regard to what computers can do. We haven't even scratched the surface of what they'll do for us. Right now, we have to tell the computer every individual thing that we want it to do, and it only does what we tell it. But in the future, it'll be able to use a problem-solving strategy and solve problems by itself. We present it with the problem, and it'll use a strategy to solve it. When I'm working on the computer, I notice I do about 100 things repeatedly over and over again. These things include using cut and paste, modifying some code snippet to do what I want it to do. Some particular tasks like read a file. Other things are launch applications. And I do these in response to what's going on around me on the computer. So I think that it is possible that we could program the computer to recognize these stimuli that are causing me to do these tasks and just have the computer do those tasks for me. Here's an abstract algorithm that we could program into the computer to help us solve any problem. So the first step is a problem occurs when there's a gap between what we actually have and what we ideally want to have. And the second step is to, after we notice that gap, we need to compare what we actually have to the ideal and see what's different. Look at the relevant and differences between the two. The third step is to translate those differences into actions that we know how to perform. And the fourth step is just to perform those actions on the actual to transform it into the ideal. When we learn how to program the computer to perform this abstract algorithm, it will be able to take any problem that we have and figure out the steps that it needs to do in order to solve the problem automatically. But right now we're not at that stage, so what we can do at this point is find manual tasks that we know how to do and automate them and build up a library of those and work towards this abstract ideal of being able to automate everything. But right now we're at a much more detailed level. Here's a high-level overview of where we're going in this video presentation. First, we're going to look at what ideal automate is. Second, I would like to look at how we, just to get a big picture, how do we know anything? And third, once we know something, how do we know that it's good? And the fourth thing I would like to do is show that ideal automate fits in between this level of what we know and what we know is good. It helps us to get to what we know is good. Okay, what is ideal automate? Ideal automate consists of three simple components. So first you have a menu screen that you can add you write these action scripts that automate little things that we know how to do, like launch an application or whatever. And you can add those action scripts to this menu screen, and that gives you easy access to launching them and to finding them. The second part of ideal automate consists of a core class C# library. It's open source. And this library just provides us with the common methods that we use to automate things like writing in stuff to the screen, finding images on the screen, launching applications, and so forth. The third component of ideal automate consists of action scripts that we write. Now these action scripts, we use template called Ideal Automate template that includes a reference to that core library I was just talking about. So we don't have to do all the heavy lifting. We let the core library do the internal plumbing for finding an image on the screen. So we don't have to recreate that wheel over and over again. So it gives us a jump start in writing these simple scripts to perform what we're trying to do. All right, that's what Ideal Automate is. Now let's look at how we come to know anything. When we want to add information to our existing body of knowledge, we use the known as a stepping stone or a bridge to help us reach out to the unknown and incorporate it into the known. A metaphor uses this technique of using the known to explain the unknown. And in 1904, J.J. Thomson used the metaphor of a plum pudding pie to explain the internal structure of an atom. Nobody had seen what the inside of an atom looked like, but this metaphor allowed everybody to get a kind of an image of what the inside of an atom looked like. Now, I think of what we know as being like a small island in the vast ocean of the unknown. And we build these bridges by using the information that we have on the island to help us reach out to understand something that was previously unknown. Plato's myth of the cave is a good example of trying to use a metaphor to map out everything that we know. Now, in the history of philosophy, there's been a search for what's most fundamental. Is it physical reality or ideas? And there's a school of thought called naive realism. This says there's a physical reality independent of our experience. And there's a problem with this approach in that it says it's independent of our experience. If it's independent, how are we ever going to verify that it exists, or how are we ever going to know it? So Plato started out with a foundation of sensations is all we can know. We can't know what's beyond our sensations. That's beyond it like a veil. But we can know our sensations. And so here's his myth of the cave to try to build a map of what we know. So he started out by saying that there's a bunch of prisoners that have been chained to a wall since birth. And they can't see what's behind them. And all they can see is the wall in front of them, and it has various shadows passing along throughout the day. And what's going on is there's some prisoners behind them that are carrying various objects. And there's a fire behind those people carrying those objects. And the fire is causing the objects to cast a shadow on the wall in front of the prisoner. Okay, let's look a little deeper at this myth of the cave. My favorite myth. So what's going on here? These prisoners are seeing these shadows on the wall in front of them. And so as the slaves behind them carry similar objects over throughout the day, the prisoners down below are seeing things that repeat. And whenever anything repeats, that should tell us right there that we can abstract that repeating property, or that whatever is repeating, to a higher class. And so that's what's behind these ideas, are actually this higher class of things that are repeating. So according to Plato, this is more real, what's behind here, than what we're seeing on this wall of shadows in front of us. Okay, in set theory, we start out with what's called a set. And the set is just a circle in a Venn diagram. And then there's what we call a essential definition, is describes the minimum properties that something must have to be a member of that set to fit in there. And so, for example, for the set of all chairs in the world, the essential definition might be something like it has to have 4 legs, a seat, and a back. That's the minimum properties that repeat over and over again for every chair out in the world. The story that I was told that helps me to connect the shadows on the wall to these ideals and set theory and classes and abstract classes and so forth was imagine that there's a horse standing out in the meadow during the day. And this horse's name was Old Dobbin. And he's standing out there, and at the early morning, the shadow that is cast by the horse is very long. It makes the horse look like a giraffe. And then at about 9 a.m., the shadow accurately matches Old Dobbin. And then at noon, it gets distorted again to look like a blob underneath him. In the afternoon, the sequence of shadows repeats in reverse order. Each of these shadows represents what we think is the actual object. And Old Dobbin represents the ideal. And so in a class, we have a variety of cars or chairs or whatever, and they match to various degrees to this ideal. Some of them are distorted, some of them don't look much like chairs, and so forth. So to recap, Plato has provided us with a map of everything that we know. He's shown us we start with the sense perceptions, the idea of a physical world that's independent of our sense perceptions was ruled out because there was no way to get to it. So we start with our sense perceptions, and then the next level is this level of abstract ideals to account for repetitions in the sense data, the things that are similar, like cars and so forth. And then at the highest level is the fire behind, and that represents awareness. So in this map of everything that we know, it seems to me that the most fundamental thing is awareness. Plato kind of resolves the dispute whether what's more fundamental, physical world. It says physical world is beyond our sense experience. So the physical world is not the most fundamental. It says ideals are more fundamental than that, than our sense experience. But it seems like there's a surprise answer, and that is that awareness is more fundamental than either of those. In Plato's map of what we know, when something is more permanent, he calls it more real. And so awareness is the most fundamental thing because it's more permanent than the other two levels. The sense experience is very transient, and we get some order by using ideals to organize things that repeat here. So ideals are more permanent. But we can't have a sense experience, or we can't experience an ideal without the awareness that's always back there experiencing each of those. So in Plato's map, awareness is the most fundamental thing. Okay, so that's the big picture of what we know. And now, when we know something, how do we know that it's good? Well, all throughout the history of philosophy, there's been a debate about, they've been looking for some properties that belong to objects that would serve as a marker to tell us, oh, this is a good thing. For example, the hedonists, they say that pleasure, whenever pleasure is a property of an object, that object is good. But we see people taking pleasure in things that are hurtful and so forth. So hedonists don't seem to be right. Utilitarians, they say that, when something produces good consequences, act on that maxim that produces the best overall consequences, is what they say. But the problem with utilitarianism is that it leads to the end justifying the means. And we know that that's not right. So there have been all these different approaches, but I think the best approach is the one that says something is good to the degree that it matches its ideal. This idea that something is good to the extent that it matches its ideal makes goodness a kind of a relative definition. It's when we want to measure the length of something, going to a physics field, we use a ruler or a yardstick, and we compare that object to the standard. Well, and when we're looking for trying to determine the goodness of something, we're also doing that same thing. We're comparing the individual object to its ideal, and the extent that it matches up, that's how good it is. Let's look at the chair example again. Suppose the ideal for a chair is that it be comfortable, it be durable, it be aesthetically pretty, and so forth. Now, this is the ideal in the back. So, and we're going to compare that to these individual chairs that are out here. So we see this chair, it has some of those properties, but not all. Here's another chair, it's not comfortable. But here's a chair that has, let's say this chair has all the properties of the ideal. We say that chair is perfect. A chair that is comfortable and durable, we might say it's good. It somewhat matches the ideal, but it doesn't match completely. And one that has very few of the properties. It's not comfortable, it's not durable, it's not pretty. It's a bad chair. So that's how we define good in this relative sense. Now, the question arises as to how we define the ideal. Okay, an ideal, we've been talking about it very abstractly, but what it really is just a mental picture in our brains of what we think the best possibility is for an object. So when we want to construct an ideal, what we usually do is we go around to the individual members in the class for that ideal and select the best properties. And we put, so we notice that this chair is comfortable and we like that chair. So we put that in the, add that property to the ideal. So that's how we construct an ideal. Some may say that I know it's good, but I don't have a clear mental picture in my brain of what's good. For example, I know a good car, but I don't know all the individual properties back here. Well, that's okay. We don't have to know all the individual properties to start out with. We can just test drive various cars and let's say we're not sure what the properties of the idea. We're not sure if having good brakes is a good property for the idea. So we go out and drive various cars, and the cars that don't have brakes, we keep on having accidents with them. And even though we don't know that this is an ideal property, we realize that having these accidents is not a good thing. So that's how we can slowly build up what the complete ideal is, even before we have the ideal itself. There's another issue involved in constructing an ideal with this relative definition of goodness. One might ask, well, aren't you using circular thinking when you say that you can cherry pick properties from these various individual objects to put it into the ideal, when the definition of goodness is that something match the ideal in the first place. So it seems like you need a different standard, and you do for cherry picking the properties of the ideal. And the standard is analogous to what we're using when we say that all the properties of an individual thing must match the properties of the ideal. What we use when cherry picking properties from these individual chairs to pick the best properties from each one. We pick those properties that will lead to the most overall fulfillment of all ideals. So when all ideals are fulfilled, then that creates the most absolute good. So that's how you get out of the relative dilemma. In our world of experience, as for the prisoners, there's kind of an attraction between the actual objects out here and the ideal behind us. And this attraction is like a tension between the north and south pole of a magnet. And this tension can be described by a field theory. In the 1800s, there was a person named Michael Faraday, and he talked about this field that exists between the north and south pole of a magnet. This feature of there being two poles is referred to as being bipolar. And this tension between the north and south pole is very similar to the tension between an actual object and the ideal that we have. Everything is drawn to being ideal in the universe, even our individual self. We're drawn to being our ideal self. And I think this tension in ourself is actually the strongest source of tension in ourself. And by strongest, I don't mean the most intense. There's other tensions like hunger and so forth that are temporarily strong. But this tension to become our ideal self is the strongest in terms of being the most enduring. We can reduce the tension that exists between the actual object and the ideal by taking action to transform the actual object into the ideal. I use two sets of libraries to help me in transforming actual objects into their ideal. The first one is the knowledge base, and the second one are my action scripts. I came upon the idea that a knowledge base is important by watching a TV show called Revolutionaries, and they were interviewing Ginny Rometty, the IBM CEO, and she was talking about an application they had created called Watson, it understands natural language. And they used that application in 2011 to beat the best champions in Jeopardy. And so that proved that Watson really did have stronger mental capabilities in playing Jeopardy than human beings. And so after 2011, they opened up Watson to use it as a business as a service for entrepreneurs. A good example of a knowledge base is Google itself. It's a very good knowledge base. But I need something more specific for the problems that I'm trying to solve at work. Google helps me with general coding problems, but it doesn't help me to remember how to do specific things that I'm doing on my job. So I use Abstract Spoon's to-do list to catalog, define everything that I learn how to do. And this allows me to write down manually how I solve individual problems as they occur. And then what I can do is set a flag and tell myself that I want to automate that later. Automated script is needed or something like that in the knowledge base. The second type of library that I use to help me automate stuff is these action scripts that I talked about with Ideal Automate. Now we've come to the point where we can put Ideal Automate in this larger picture of everything that we know. And where it fits is between the actual and the ideal. It helps us to transform what is actual into the ideal.